April 7th, 1945, 2:47 in the afternoon, the Pacific Ocean, the waters north of Okinawa. Picture hell. But not the hell depicted on ancient scrolls with its fire, cauldrons, and demons. Picture a hell of absolute chaos where the very fabric of existence is tearing itself apart. And at the center of this hell, a man. One man. His name is Kenji Tanaka. He is 19 years old, and he is already dead. He doesn't know it yet, but his body, coated in a thick, sticky layer of fuel oil, no longer belongs to him. It belongs to the ocean. His lungs burn from the salt water mixed with fuel, every breath a torture, every exhale a moan. He clings to a piece of wreckage, something that just an hour ago was part of the greatest and most invincible ship in human history. Now, it is just a blackened, twisted wooden panel, his Noah's Ark, in the middle of the apocalypse. Around him stretches a vast, iridescent oil slick, shimmering like the eye of a giant, dying deity. Floating in this eye are other pieces of debris, life preservers, overturned lifeboats, and bodies. Hundreds of bodies. His comrades. The men with whom he shared rice and cigarettes, the men he laughed with just last night. Now, they are merely silent, black silhouettes on the surface of the black water. The silence that followed the deafening roar and screech of sinking metal presses on the eardrums more intensely than any explosion. It is the silence of the grave. A massive, communal grave for 3,000 men. But Kenji hears a sound. Faint at first, barely audible, like someone tearing silk fabric underwater. Shh. A pause. Shh. He lifts his head, his eyes inflamed by the oil struggle to focus, and he sees them. First one, a dark, triangular fin, slicing through the oily surface with an unnatural, soul-chilling ease. Then a second, a third, a 10th. They glide between the bodies, unhurried, confident, like masters come to collect their due. They are the gray ghosts of the ocean, sharks, the blood of the wounded, the scent of death. It has all turned the site of the greatest naval tragedy into a feasting ground. And Kenji, alive, breathing, his heart pounding in his chest, understands that he is the main course. He clutches his piece of wreckage so tightly his fingernails dig into the wood. He freezes, afraid to breathe, afraid to move. He is no longer a sailor of the Imperial Navy. He is no longer a man. He has become a piece of meat, desperately trying to postpone the moment he will be devoured. In that instant, in his clouded consciousness, there were no thoughts of homeland, of the Emperor, of honor. There was only one, primal, animalistic desire. To live. To live. For just one more minute. One more breath. One more heartbeat. He survived an explosion that could have wiped a small city off the face of the earth, only to find himself here, at the very center of the food chain, where he was no longer a predator, but merely prey. And this was only the beginning of his torment. But to understand how a steel giant turned into a mass grave, and a young sailor into bait for sea predators, we must go back just a few hours. To that morning, when the sun was still shining, and the battleship Yamato was a symbol not of agony, but of the indestructible might of the Japanese Empire. The morning of April 7th, 1945, was surprisingly clear. The sky over the East China Sea was pristine, almost white from the bright spring sun. A light breeze barely wrinkled the dark blue surface of the water, and it seemed as if the ocean itself was holding its breath in anticipation. On the deck of the battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever built by man, an atmosphere of tense, almost ritualistic calm prevailed. Kenji Tanaka, a gunner in a 25mm anti-aircraft crew on the port side, felt this calm in every cell of his body. It was like the silence before a typhoon, the still air before an earthquake. He stood at his post, polishing the breech of his gun with a soft cloth, bringing the cold steel to a mirror shine. He was 19 years old, and the Yamato was his home, his universe, his deity. He remembered the first time he saw her in the Kyodock, a gigantic gray mountain that seemed to prop up the sky. 72,000 tons of displacement, 9 monstrous 460mm main guns capable of hurling a shell the weight of a car over 42 kilometers, about 26 miles. The Yamato was not just a ship. She was the embodiment of the nation's spirit, its last hope, a steel fist raised for one final decisive blow. And they were sailing on that final voyage. Operation Tengo, a suicide attack on the American fleet at Okinawa. They had barely enough fuel, just enough to reach the target. There was no plan for a return journey. They were to beach themselves and become an impregnable fortress, fighting to the last shell, to the last man. Everyone on board knew this. No one spoke of it aloud, but the knowledge hung in the air, mixing with the smell of salt and hot metal. It was in the grim faces of the officers, in the silent focus of his crewmates, in the meticulous way they checked every mechanism, every rivet. Kenji finished his cleaning and looked at his friends. Nearby stood Tadashi, a stocky fisherman from Hokkaido who could tell the depth by the color of the water. He silently chewed on dried squid, his gaze fixed on the horizon. A little further away sat old Ishihara, a former calligraphy teacher who, even on a warship, managed to maintain an imperturbable calm, painting characters on scraps of paper. He said it helped bring order to the chaos in his soul. They were not fanatics eager for death. They were ordinary men, torn from their lives by war. Kenji remembered his home in a small village at the foot of a mountain. The scent of blossoming sakura, his younger sister's laughter, his mother's warm hands offering him a bowl of rice. Last night he had written her a letter, a short one, just a few lines. He wrote that he was well, that he was proud to serve on the greatest ship, and asked her not to worry. He knew the letter would most likely never be sent. It was his farewell ritual, his conversation with the past. At 12 o'clock noon, the call to battle stations echoed across the ship. It wasn't sharp or unexpected. It was long awaited. Everyone took their positions. Kenji put on his steel helmet, checked the straps. His heart beat a little faster, but there was no fear. There was only a cold, ringing emptiness in his stomach and absolute clarity in his mind. He was part of a huge mechanism, a cog in a steel machine of death. His task was simple: fire at enemy planes as long as he was alive. He looked to the horizon. At first, they appeared as tiny black dots like a swarm of annoying insects. But this swarm grew with terrifying speed. Within a minute, they could already make out the silhouettes. Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntlesses, hundreds of them. There were so many it seemed the sky itself had turned black. And in that moment, Kenji did not yet know that the gleaming steel of his gun, which he had polished with such care that morning, would in a few hours become part of a twisted, red-hot hell. He did not know that the ocean he had been admiring would become his prison and his executioner. He just waited for the command, staring into the face of approaching death, never suspecting that the most terrible horror awaited him not in the fire of battle, but in the cold, oily water that would follow. The first wave of American planes fell upon the Yamato and its escort at 12:37. The air shattered into 1,000 pieces from the roar of aircraft engines, the howl of diving bombers, and the deafening thunder of every gun the Japanese fleet could bring to bear on the enemy. Kenji Tanaka's world shrank to the size of his anti-aircraft gun mount. All he saw was the crosshairs of his sight and the enemy machines flashing within them. His fingers seemed to have grown into the triggers. The gun beneath him came alive, shaking, spitting fiery tracers into the sky. Indescribable chaos reigned around him. The deck shuddered from nearby bomb explosions. Gigantic columns of water shot into the air, crashing down on the ship in tons of salt water, mixing with sweat, blood, and soot. Kenji didn't hear the screams. He didn't see his comrades falling beside him. His entire world was focused on a single goal: to shoot down, to destroy, to keep them from breaking through. He fired, reloaded, fired again. The automatic movements drilled into him by months of training saved him from panic, from the realization that he was at the very center of a fiery vortex. The first bomb struck the bow near the main turret. The ship shuddered as if it had hit an underwater reef. Kenji momentarily lost his balance but held on, clinging to the gun carriage. He saw a plume of black smoke erupt over the deck. Then another hit, this time at the stern. The Americans acted in concert, methodically, like surgeons dissecting a living body. Torpedo bombers approached from different sides, releasing their deadly cigars. The Yamato, despite her colossal size, tried to evade, to maneuver, but she was too large, too unwieldy a target. Kenji saw the white, foamy trails the torpedoes left on the water, inexorably approaching the ship's side. An impact. Another. And another. Each time, the battleship trembled with its entire enormous body, and this tremor resonated in Kenji's legs, his bones, his teeth. The list to port was becoming more pronounced. Walking on the deck became difficult. Old Ishihara, who was feeding him ammunition, fell, and the clips scattered across the deck like dominoes. Tadashi helped him up, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He was shouting something, but his voice was lost in the din of battle. A second wave, a third. The attacks followed one after another, with almost no pause. The sky swarmed with planes. Kenji was no longer aiming. He was just laying down suppressive fire in the direction the enemy appeared from. The barrel of his gun glowed red hot. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal filled his nostrils. At one point, he saw one of the American planes, hit by another gun crew, catch fire and trailing black smoke, hurtle straight toward them. Time slowed down. Kenji saw the pilot's face in the cockpit, saw the plane grow larger, turning into a fireball. He screamed, but the cry stuck in his throat. The plane crashed into the superstructure somewhere above them. A wave of fire washed over the deck, singeing his eyebrows and hair. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the ship was doomed. She had taken at least 10 torpedo and 5 bomb hits. The list had reached 20 degrees. It was impossible to walk on the deck. One had to cling to anything at hand. The command to abandon ship never came. Or perhaps no one heard it in that hell. It all happened suddenly. At 2:23 in the afternoon, as the list to port became critical, the Yamato began to capsize. Kenji felt the deck slip out from under his feet. He saw men and guns break loose and slide toward the water. And in that moment, there was an explosion. It wasn't the explosion of a bomb or a torpedo. It was something unimaginable. The main battery magazines, where hundreds of tons of explosives were stored, detonated. A gigantic mushroom cloud, later estimated to be 6 kilometers, nearly 4 miles high, shot up into the sky. The blast wave was monstrous. It ripped Kenji from the deck like a feather. The last thing he felt was an unbearable heat that seemed to burn him alive, and a terrible impact that knocked the wind out of him and hurled him into darkness. He was flying, tumbling through the air amidst fragments of metal, fire, and water. He felt no pain, felt nothing. His consciousness winked out, drowned in the deafening silence that followed the greatest explosion in the history of naval warfare. The battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial fleet, broke in two and, in a matter of minutes, slipped beneath the waves, carrying the souls of more than 3,000 sailors with it. Kenji Tanaka was one of them. But by some cruel irony of fate, his body was still alive. The return to the world was slow, agonizing, like being reborn into some nightmarish, distorted dimension. The first sensation was cold. Not just cold, but an all-pervading, bone-chilling cold that seemed to have seeped into his very marrow and frozen the blood in his veins. Then came the taste. A vile, bitter mixture of salt, metal, and something viscous, oily, that coated his tongue and induced gagging. Kenji coughed, and his lungs exploded in pain. He spat out a mouthful of the foul liquid and gasped for air. The air was heavy, saturated with the acrid smell of fuel oil and smoke. He opened his eyes but saw nothing. His eyelids were sealed shut by a thick, sticky film. He painstakingly wiped them with the back of his hand, and the world slowly came into view, blurry and surreal, like the painting of a drunken artist. He was lying on the water. The sky above him was a dull, indifferent gray, veiled by smoke from the fire still burning on the ocean's surface, and the ocean itself. It was black. Not dark blue, but a thick, viscous black, like tar. A massive oil slick, spreading for kilometers around the site of the Yamato's sinking, had turned the water into a mire. Kenji moved and realized he wasn't sinking. The dense layer of fuel mixed with water kept him afloat like a cork. He looked around, and then the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. All around, as far as the eye could see, debris floated in the black sludge. Twisted sheets of metal, charred planks, life preservers, some crates, and bodies. Dozens, hundreds of bodies. His comrades. They bobbed on the waves, coated in the same black film as he was. Some lay face down, motionless. Others were alive. From this oily porridge came moans, cries for help, curses. It was a chorus of the dying, a symphony of agony. Panic, cold and sticky like the oil itself, began to creep into his heart. The Yamato, the explosion. He remembered everything. He remembered the fireball, the flight, the impact with the water. He had survived. But what now? He was alone, in the middle of a boundless ocean, at the center of a massive oil slick, surrounded by the dying. He tried to swim, but his movements were stiff and labored. The fuel oil had clung to his clothes, making them as heavy as a knight's armor. He flailed, swallowing more and more of the toxic mixture. Desperation began to suffocate him more than the lack of air. He screamed, but his cry was a weak, pathetic squeak that was lost in the collective groan. And then he saw it. A small but sturdy-looking piece of wooden decking, perhaps 2 by 3 meters. His salvation. His island. He summoned his last reserves of strength and swam toward it, churning his arms and legs, ignoring the pain in his burned skin and the stinging in his eyes. Every meter was an immense struggle. The water, if you could call it that, resisted, unwilling to release its victim. Finally, his fingers touched the rough, splintered surface. He pulled himself up, heaved his exhausted body over the edge, and collapsed onto this makeshift raft, gasping for breath. He lay there for several minutes, unable to move, listening to the frantic pounding of his own heart. He was safe. Relatively, fragilely, but safe nonetheless. He was saved. He didn't yet know that this salvation was merely a reprieve. He didn't yet understand that the ocean, having taken his ship, was not finished with him. He was just a wounded animal, thrown into an arena, and the main predators had not yet entered the hunt. Lifting his head, he saw another man not far from him, struggling desperately in the water. His face was contorted with pain, one arm hung limply at his side. Their eyes met. The man's gaze was filled with pleading. Kenji hesitated for only a moment. He couldn't leave him there. He had to help. This decision, dictated by the remnants of his humanity, seemed the only right one. But it was this very act that drew unwanted, deadly attention from the depths to their small island of salvation. Having found a fragile stability on his piece of decking, Kenji felt the primal shock begin to recede, replaced by a cold, sober assessment of the situation. He was alive. He was afloat. This was his first, tiny victory in the war against death. But this victory was as precarious as his raft. The ocean around him was not just water. It was a soup of wreckage, fuel, and human suffering. The cry for help he had heard pierced the veil of his own despair. He saw a sailor desperately trying to stay on the surface. It was Yukio, a senior sailor from another gun crew. Kenji knew him. They had crossed paths a few times in the barracks. Yukio was older, by about 10 years, and had always seemed cynical and taciturn. Now his face was a mask of pure, animal terror. His right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood seeped from a wound on his shoulder, leaving dark, almost invisible slicks on the black surface of the oil. It was this blood, as Kenji would later realize, that became their curse. "Hold on!" Kenji shouted, his own voice sounding foreign and weak. He lay on his stomach, leaned over the edge of his raft, and extended a hand. "Come on! Grab it!" Yukio, mustering his last strength, swam closer. His breathing was ragged, wheezing. He grabbed Kenji's outstretched hand. His grip was weak, almost lifeless. Kenji tensed every muscle. His body, weakened and covered in slippery fuel oil, barely obeyed him. He pulled, grunting with effort, his feet braced against the edge of the wreckage to keep from sliding back into the viscous water. Finally, with a superhuman effort, he managed to haul Yukio onto the raft. The men collapsed beside him, breathing heavily and groaning in pain. For a few minutes they lay in silence, two exhausted, oil-covered creatures on a small island in the midst of boundless chaos. "Thank you," Yukio rasped. "We're going to make it," Kenji replied, more to himself than to him. He was trying to force himself to believe those words. They had to survive. They would be picked up. The destroyers from the escort. Some of them must have survived. Hope was the only thing they had left. Their unexpected weapon against the all-consuming despair. Kenji tore a strip of cloth from his tattered uniform and, as best he could, bandaged the wound on Yukio's shoulder to stop the bleeding. It was a pathetic excuse for a dressing, but it was all he could do. They sat, huddled together for warmth, silently gazing at the nightmare stretching out around them. The sun began to set, painting the sky in crimson hues. The sunset was painfully beautiful, and its beauty felt blasphemous against the backdrop of the unfolding tragedy. And that's when they appeared. Kenji noticed them first. A fin. A perfectly straight dark gray triangle slicing through the oily water with frightening purpose. It moved not erratically but in a wide circle around them. Kenji froze, his heart sinking into his stomach. He followed the fin's movement. It completed a circle and disappeared beneath the surface. "What is it?" Yukio asked, noticing the tension on Kenji's face. Kenji didn't answer. He didn't want to believe it. Maybe he had imagined it. A dolphin? No. He knew what dolphins looked like. This was something else. Then another fin appeared, and another. They circled, gradually tightening the ring. They were in no hurry. They were studying. The ocean, which had just been their enemy for its cold indifference, now had a face, or rather, hundreds of faces with empty black eyes and rows of razor-sharp teeth. Yukio's blood, the blood of hundreds of other wounded men in the water, had become a beacon, a dinner bell, summoning the most terrifying predators of the deep. Kenji grabbed Yukio's good arm. "Don't move," he whispered. Not a sound. They sat, transformed into living statues, watching the gray shadows glide around their fragile sanctuary. Every splash of water, every cry of a dying man in the distance, struck their hearts like a death knell. They had defeated fire, they had defeated steel, they had escaped a sinking coffin. But now they understood that it had all been just the beginning. Their small victory, their island of salvation, had attracted the attention of the true masters of these waters. And those masters were hungry. With the arrival of the sharks, time lost its usual flow. It stretched into an endless, viscous substance, where every second was filled with concentrated horror. Kenji and Yukio sat on their piece of wreckage, which now seemed less like a life-saving ark and more like a sacrificial altar. They had created their own tiny empire in the midst of chaos, but its borders were marked by an invisible line, patrolled by the gray sentinels of death. Their survival system was primitively simple. Don't move, don't make noise, don't attract attention. They breathed shallowly, fearing that even the sound of their breath might signal an attack. Kenji took on the role of leader, of the watchman. His eyes, inflamed and red, continuously scanned the black surface of the water, tracking every fin, every movement, every suspicious splash. He made Yukio talk, to keep him from losing consciousness from the pain and cold. He asked him simple questions. Where was he from? Did he have a family? What did he dream of? It was their own desperate form of psychotherapy, an attempt to preserve their sanity, to hold on to the thin line between reality and madness. "I have a daughter," Yukio whispered, his lips barely moving. "She's 5. Her name is Hana. She loves it when I make her little boats out of paper." These words, fragments of a peaceful, long-lost life, sounded like a prayer here, in the middle of this hell. They were their only connection to a world where humans were not just food for fish. Kenji listened and nodded, while thinking of his own mother, of her warm hands. These memories were their armor, fragile but the only one they had. As twilight fell, the terror intensified. In the darkness, the imagination painted the most horrific pictures. Every lap of a wave against their raft felt like the touch of a predator. They couldn't see the sharks, but they felt their presence. It was in the very air, in the oppressive silence broken occasionally by the distant, fading cries of those less fortunate. Sometimes a loud splash would erupt nearby, followed by a short, choked-off scream. And then silence again. Kenji and Yukio would flinch and huddle even closer. Their tiny empire, their nation of 2, lived by a single law, the law of fear. The temperature dropped sharply during the night. The cold seeped into their bones. Their wet clothes, caked in a crust of fuel oil and salt, offered no warmth, instead leaching the last vestiges of heat from their bodies. Their teeth chattered so violently it felt as if they would shatter. Kenji tried to rub his and Yukio's hands and feet to get the blood flowing, but their limbs were like ice. Yukio began to drift into delirium. He spoke to his daughter, promising her he would be home soon. His voice was faint, almost unintelligible. Kenji knew he was fading. The wound, the cold, and the blood loss were taking their toll. He tried to bring him around, shaking his shoulders, shouting in his ear, but Yukio sank deeper into his own ghostly world. Kenji felt the despair he had held at bay for so long begin to gnaw at him from within. He was the leader. He was the rock. But that rock was slowly crumbling under the blows of merciless waves. He looked at the dark water. The fins were not visible, but he knew they were there, waiting, patiently, as befits perfect killers. And in that moment, in that endless, cold night, a rebellion began to stir in his soul. Not against Yukio, not against the enemy. A rebellion against fate itself, against the gods who had allowed this nightmare. He clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He would not give up. He would live. For his mother. For Yukio and his little daughter, Hana. He would fight to his last breath. But he did not yet know that his greatest internal conflict was still ahead. The moment when he would have to choose between the instinct for self-preservation and the remnants of human compassion. The peak of their agony came in the pre-dawn hours, when the darkness is thickest and the cold reaches its limit. Yukio was barely responding to Kenji's words. His breathing had become shallow, and his body was racked with fine tremors. He was on the brink. Kenji, himself exhausted beyond measure, continued his desperate fight for his comrade's life. He held him, trying to warm him with his own body, whispering words of encouragement, telling fabricated stories of how a destroyer was just about to rescue them. It was a lie, but it was the only medicine he had. The internal conflict that had been brewing in Kenji's soul reached its climax. A part of him, the part responsible for survival, the primal instinct, was whispering terrible things. Yukio is a burden. He is wounded. He is weak. He is attracting predators. His groans and the smell of his blood are a death sentence for both of them. If he were alone, he could lie still, motionless, merge with the wreckage, become invisible. But another part of his soul, the part that still remembered honor, camaraderie, and humanity, screamed in horror at these thoughts. He couldn't abandon him. He couldn't become an animal. This internal battle was more terrifying than any fight with a shark. It was a battle for his own soul. Kenji looked at Yukio's pain-twisted face and saw in it a reflection of his own fear and desperation. Defeating this inner enemy was his main task. He made his choice. He would remain a man, even if it cost him his life. He would care for Yukio until the end, whatever that end might be. But fate, as if hearing his decision, decided to put him through one last, most cruel test. At one point, Yukio regained consciousness. He opened his eyes, and for a moment, awareness flickered within them. He looked at Kenji, then at his own wounded leg, at the dark water around them. "Are they still there?" he whispered. Kenji nodded silently. Yukio closed his eyes. A tear rolled down his cheek, leaving a clean track on his oil-stained skin. "I don't want them to..." His voice broke, and then he did something Kenji never expected. Summoning an incredible last burst of strength, Yukio pushed away from Kenji and tried to slide off the raft into the water. It wasn't an act of rebellion or panic. It was an act of desperate, twisted self-sacrifice. He had decided to go on his own terms, to give Kenji a chance. "No!" Kenji screamed, grabbing his clothes. He pulled him back, but his weakened arms wouldn't obey. Yukio was a dead weight, his body limp. Their struggle on the edge of the small raft upset its fragile balance. The raft rocked, and that was enough. Out of the darkness, silently and swiftly, a huge gray shadow emerged. Kenji didn't have time to process anything. He saw only for a split second a gaping maw with several rows of triangular teeth. There was a dull thud against the wood that nearly flipped the raft. Yukio cried out. It wasn't a scream of pain, but a short, surprised gasp. Kenji felt a sharp tug. The fabric of Yukio's uniform, which he was holding, tore in his hands with a loud rip. Yukio's body vanished under the water. For an instant, Kenji saw his wide-open, horrified eyes staring up at him from the black depths. Then there was a loud splash. The water around the raft churned and turned a dark color, thicker and more terrifying than the oil. And then there was silence. Absolute, deafening silence. The inner enemy had been defeated. Yukio was gone. But while Kenji had been fighting for his humanity, the external enemy, the ruthless and primal ocean, had delivered its devastating blow. Kenji was left alone. The void on the raft beside him felt immense, bottomless. It pressed down on him more heavily than the entire sky. The silence that followed the short, violent struggle rang in his ears. He stared at the spot where Yukio had just been, unable to believe it. It had all happened so fast, so terrifyingly mundane. There was no long struggle, no screams, just a brief splash, and a man was gone. The ocean had claimed him, as if settling a minor debt. Kenji sat, stunned. The shock was so profound that he felt neither cold nor fear. He felt only an icy, all-consuming loneliness. He was the last man in a dead world. The memory of Yukio's wide-open eyes, looking up at him from under the water, burned into his brain. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapped his arms around them, and curled into a ball, trying to make himself as small, as inconspicuous as possible. He was now the only living bait for miles around, and they knew he was here. He could feel their gazes from the deep. He no longer dared to look at the water. He stared at the sky, which was slowly beginning to lighten in the east. But the dawn brought no relief. On the contrary, with the first rays of sun, came a new enemy, the wind. It started as a light breeze, but with each passing minute it grew stronger and colder. The sky, which had been gray, began to darken, filling with a leaden heaviness. The waves rose. Small at first, they merely rocked his raft gently, but soon they grew into high, angry swells with white crests. His small island of salvation became a plaything in the hands of the raging elements. He was tossed upward onto a wave's crest, which offered a view of the endless churning sea, and then plunged downward into a trough, where it seemed the next wave would surely swallow him. Cold spray lashed his face, salt water repeatedly finding its way into his mouth, causing nausea. Kenji clung to the edges of his raft with the strength of a drowning man. Every muscle in his body was strained to its limit. Now he was fighting not only the predators who seemed to have temporarily retreated before the storm's fury, but the ocean itself. This was the ultimate test, a battle with the abyss. The ocean was trying to wash him away, to drown him, to smash his fragile shelter to splinters. Every wave was a blow, every drop of water an enemy bullet. The hours of this struggle blurred into one endless nightmare. He lost track of time. His body grew numb from the cold and tension. His consciousness began to fade. He no longer felt fear. He felt only an infinite weariness. He wanted to just let go, to let the water take him, to sleep, to end this pointless torment. And then the hallucinations began. He thought he heard his mother's voice calling his name. He saw the blooming sakura in his village. He smelled freshly cooked rice. These visions were so vivid, so real, that for a moment he forgot where he was. He smiled. This was the end, and it wasn't so terrible. He closed his eyes, ready to accept his fate. But something inside him, some stubborn, unyielding core that had not been broken by the explosion, the sharks, or the storm, refused to surrender. He opened his eyes. Through the curtain of rain and spray, on the crest of another wave, he saw something on the horizon. A dark silhouette. It was far away, almost indistinguishable. Another hallucination? He shook his head, trying to dispel the vision. The silhouette did not disappear. It was slowly approaching. It was a ship. Faint, ghostly, but definitely a ship. Hope, which he had thought long dead, flared in his chest with such force that he screamed. It was not a scream of terror. It was the hoarse, desperate cry of a man who had seen a light at the end of the longest, darkest tunnel of his life. The silhouette on the horizon slowly took shape. It was a destroyer, a Japanese destroyer. Kenji recognized it by its distinctive profile, most likely one of the escort ships that had survived the meat grinder. It was approaching, slowly, cautiously, navigating through the field of debris. To Kenji, it wasn't just a ship. It was a divine messenger, appearing from another world to take him from this hell. The euphoria of rescue was so overwhelming that for a moment he forgot everything. The cold, the pain, the dead Yukio, the sharks that were surely still lurking somewhere nearby. He gathered his last ounces of strength and began to shout, waving his arms, trying to attract attention. His voice was weak, his movements barely perceptible against the raging waves. But they saw him. The ship changed course and headed straight for him. Kenji watched as the steel behemoth grew closer and tears streamed down his face, mixing with the rain and salty spray. When the destroyer was very close, a rope ladder was thrown from its side. Several sailors, their faces tense and grim, looked down at him. In their eyes, Kenji saw a mixture of pity, astonishment, and horror. He was the first living person they had found in this area. He paddled to the side of the ship. His body was so weak, he couldn't even grab the ladder. Two sailors climbed down and, taking him by the armpits, struggled to haul him onto the deck. Once on the solid, steel surface, Kenji collapsed, drained of all strength. He lay there, unable to move, feeling the cold, vibrating metal of the deck against his cheek. The hum of the living ship was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He was immediately surrounded. Someone covered him with a dry blanket, someone else held a canteen of warm water to his lips. The first sip burned his throat, but it was the most delicious water of his life. The contrast between his condition and the world he had entered was staggering. Here were clean, dry people, order, functioning machinery, and he was a filthy, stinking, half-dead creature fished out of an oil swamp. He was carried to the sickbay. A medic carefully cut away the remnants of his oil-soaked uniform and washed the thick layer of crude from his body. Every touch sent waves of pain through his burned and scratched skin. When he had been cleaned up a bit, an officer entered the sickbay. He was young, but his face looked tired and old. He sat down beside Kenji's bunk. "What's your name, sailor?" he asked. "Kenji Tanaka, from the battleship Yamato," Kenji answered hoarsely. The officer nodded. "We've picked up a few dozen more, out of 3,000. He didn't finish. There was no need. Kenji understood the scale of the catastrophe. His personal survival, his nightmare with the sharks and the storm, it all seemed so insignificant against that monstrous number. He tried to tell the officer about Yukio, about how they had stayed together, about how a shark had taken him. He spoke haltingly, choking on words and tears. The officer listened in silence, his face a stone mask. When Kenji finished, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did well to survive, Tanaka," he said in a flat voice. "But your story, it's best to forget it. It doesn't matter now. We lost the Yamato. We lost a symbol of the nation. Your sharks. That's a trivial matter. No one must know of such things. It is a disgrace to the fleet." Those words hit Kenji harder than any wave. He had survived hell. He had watched his comrade be torn to pieces. He had fought for his life every second for nearly a full day. And he was being told it was a trifle. A disgrace. He realized that his rescue was just the beginning of a new circle of torment. He had escaped a physical prison only to enter a prison of silence and oblivion. His feat, his incredible story of survival, was an inconvenient truth the system wanted to hide. He was rescued only to have his story buried alive. Kenji Tanaka survived. His body, broken but alive, returned to the soil of Japan. But his soul remained there, in the black, oily waters of Okinawa. He returned to a country in its death throes, a country losing the war. Soon, the blasts over Hiroshima and Nagasaki sounded, and the empire surrendered. His personal tragedy, his incredible survival, was drowned, dissolved in the ocean of national catastrophe. No one wanted to hear stories of defeat, of weakness, of horrors that didn't fit the code of Bushido. The story of a sailor who clung to a piece of wreckage in fear for nearly a day while sharks devoured his comrades was not heroic. It was shameful. He, like the other few survivors from the Yamato, was quickly demobilized after signing a non-disclosure agreement. Their brotherhood, forged in fire and death, was destroyed by an order from above. Their ordeal was officially erased from history. Kenji returned to his village, but he found no home. It had been destroyed in a bombing raid. His mother and sister were dead. He was utterly alone, a man with no past and no future. He tried to live a normal life. He found a job at the port, mending fishing nets, but he couldn't. Every day he saw the sea and it stared back at him with empty, cold eyes. At night, he was plagued by nightmares. Again and again he was back on his raft, seeing Yukio's eyes, feeling the icy cold and the sticky fuel oil on his skin. He would wake up in a cold sweat, screaming. The people in the village avoided him. They saw in his eyes the kind of horror that was not meant to be spoken of. He was a living ghost, a reminder of a lost war. He never married, never had children. He couldn't allow himself to get attached to anyone, knowing how easily it could all be lost. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life. His only companion a bottle of cheap sake. He never told anyone his full story. Sometimes, when drunk, he might drop a few phrases about gray shadows and black water. But his drinking buddies would just shake their heads, thinking him mad. The experience had changed him forever. He, a survivor of the most terrible naval battle, was afraid of the water. He never again went into the sea deeper than his knees. The ocean, which had been a part of his fisherman ancestors' lives, had become his own personal hell. He died many years later in the mid-70s, quietly, in his small shack, from liver disease, a lonely, forgotten old man. Only a few people attended his funeral. None of them knew that this silent alcoholic man was once a hero who had survived the unimaginable. He took his secret with him to the grave. Of the more than 3,000 men in the crew of the battleship Yamato, fewer than 300 were saved. Each of them had their own story of survival, their own pain, their own hell. But Kenji Tanaka's story was special. It wasn't about heroism on the battlefield, but about the quiet, desperate struggle for the right to take one more breath when nothing was left but death. But for a story not to die completely, it had to become something more than just a memory. Official history forgot Kenji Tanaka. His name is not carved on memorials. He is not written about in textbooks. The bureaucratic machine of war and its aftermath chewed up his ordeal and spat it out as an inconvenient fact. His struggle was too personal, too terrifying, too unheroic for the grand chronicles. Heroes were supposed to be those who died with weapons in hand, screaming banzai, not those who trembled in fear on a piece of wood while predators devoured their comrades. But what official history erases, folk memory often preserves, turning facts into legend. The story of the Yamato sailor who drifted for hours in a shark-infested oil slick did not disappear without a trace. It became a soldier's tale, whispered among the few survivors. It was passed from one to another in hospitals, in ports, in fishing taverns. Over time, of course, it grew embellished, becoming more and more incredible. They said he didn't just drift, but fought off the sharks with his bare hands. They said he swam to shore on his own, covering dozens of kilometers. Among the fishermen of the Ryukyu Islands, a belief took hold that the ghost of this lone sailor still wanders those waters, protecting those who find themselves in trouble at sea. His story became a legend, a myth about the indomitable will to live, which can stand against not only enemy weapons but also the most primal forces of nature. Kenji Tanaka, forgotten by official history, found immortality in folklore. He became a symbol not of a nation's triumph, but of the triumph of a single small man in the face of the abyss. His tragic greatness lay not in victory, but in the very act of struggle. He lost the battle against the wider world, with its cynicism and neglect, but he won his most important war, the war against despair, madness, and the ocean itself. This story is not just a chronicle of one episode of the Second World War. It is a reminder that behind the dry statistics of casualties and the grand names of operations, there are always real people, with their fears, their hopes, and their incredible, almost divine ability to fight for life, even when the universe itself seems to want them dead. The story of Kenji Tanaka is a hymn to the human spirit, which, even when covered in filth, fuel oil, and blood, continues to burn with a steady, stubborn flame. And as long as we remember stories like these forgotten heroes live on. Let us know in the comments what you think about this story, about the strength of the human spirit, and the price that must be paid for survival. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that deserve to be heard.